Louise is a research manager and interim head of research at Figma. You may have heard of that company. It's pretty cool. And Louise was previously at Airbnb.
And Instagram.
And Instagram. Good Lord. That's a pretty cool resume. And our friend Zoe is a senior UX researcher at Google. And you've been doing a ton of mentorship, kind of like pretty consistently. I think you've got a pretty good lay of the land. So we're really excited to have you on this panel as well. And we're going to kind of kick things off. So that was my intro for you guys. Maybe you guys can kind of give a little bit of history as to how you ended up in research. Maybe starting with you, Louise.
Sure. So I actually come into this field from academia. I got into anthropology and got a PhD in anthropology and education. And nobody told me about the world of UX research when I was in academia. But magically landed in the Bay Area, heard about people doing ethnographic research, and I was like, I think I know something about this, and started networking and talking to people, and got a contract position at Samsung, and then parlayed that into a full-time role actually at Chegg, which is an ed tech company. So That's how I entered.
So back from academia. Zoe, yourself?
Yeah, I also took kind of a weird route in. I have a master's in wildlife biology, where I studied things like wolves and birds and land use. And it was great. I'll be honest, I loved it. It did involve a 3-hour commute to Sacramento, which turns out I didn't love. So shout out for my husband for calmly pulling me to the side one day and saying, this might not be sustainable long term. And he was a UX designer and was like, I think you'd be really interested in this thing called research. And then shout out to Rob Yeomans of YouTube at the time, now he's at Workspace, still within Google, who took a shot on me and brought me into UX research. I've been here for a while, absolutely loved it. And actually really got into mentorship and thinking about this thanks to Alec. When I spoke at a conference on, of all things, the role of religion in UX research. So if you want to talk about that, let me know.
It's a great talk, by the way. That was one of my favorite ones. Often not talked about, which makes it really fun.
But grateful to be here, grateful to be back here. Feels very full circle moment.
It sure is. So it's interesting just right off the bat, the role of serendipity. I think when we look at a lot of the LinkedIn profiles, maybe of people who've been in the field for a while, it feels like extremely linear. Right? Like obviously you did a master's degree at wherever, and then you've confidently and swiftly and easily moved into a role at Facebook. And it's not, that's only works in retrospect. That's not really how it worked at the time, right? Before we get into the actual hiring process stuff, I think it's really important to level set on what the role actually is, right? And I think there's a lot of misconceptions, maybe. I think as researchers, sometimes we get a little navel-gazing and we think about our role as methods doers, but maybe that's not a full and accurate picture. So, Louise, how do you think about the role of research? Like, what is the job to be done, if you will, that we get hired to do?
I think at its core, most simply, it's about informing decisions. And we work at companies that are often for-profit companies, so it is about the business, the decisions that are really driving the business. And those can occur not just within the area that we are staffed within, like product, but that could be in sales if you're in B2B. That could be in finance. That could be in corporate development. That could be in a lot of different areas of the full range of the company. So. Yep.
And so just by implication of that, methods is only one part, and like doing the research is only one part.
It's the means to the end, is what I mean.
Got it. So would you agree?
Yeah, I think I would totally agree. And it's interesting. I think one of the things that people really struggle with at first is we often look for a right answer. This idea that there is some correctness that will somehow magically inform everything we do. And that's never going to be the case. It's always relative to what you're actually trying to figure out and what those constraints are and what those opportunities are. And just as much as it is figuring out the method, it's figuring out how do I navigate through all of that to get where I want to go. When we think about academia or we think about proper research, we're trying to write these papers that like hopefully 500 people cite. And by the way, it's in Nature and it's also open source and it has to work for everyone, right? Anybody can take that and apply it to where they are. But if you're doing research for Lyft, you just want it to work for Lyft. You actually kind of hope it doesn't work for Uber. that there is something unique in your brand or your approach that makes it yours. So it's very, I think when you first come in, it feels biased or it feels, manipulative is the wrong word, but there's something you're getting through. But there's actually so much of that you're really trying to tailor your very, very specific success relative to everything around you. And yes, the methods get you there, but there's a lot in figuring out how to even open that door. I would say like 20% methods, 30% therapist, 50% everything else.
I'm reminded a bit of a talk from a conference years ago from the team at Slack, and they talked about the way they look at research, and they're a really interesting team. The role of research as like your forward scout of like a band of merry men and women traversing through a scary jungle to get to the kingdom of happiness at the end. So that's the role that they kind of play. Does that metaphor, or are there other things that you think about when you think about the research role that you say, like, this is actually a good analogy for what we're doing, as you describe the role to other people that come to mind?
I would say yes and no, it depends. It is one way to position research, is to send out that scout to determine if there's an opportunity there. What are the risks? What are the ways that we can de-risk things? But I've equally seen it happen where the researcher is running alongside the product team, or to either scout out a brand new opportunity, because sometimes you need to develop concepts in order to sort of flesh out, like, what is this thing? Also, there are plenty of times when when the business has made a decision and they're like, hey, we're going for this. The engineering team has already gotten the green light. And I'd sort of liken it to research running alongside the speeding train. And our goal is to point out what are the risks and how do we mitigate those along the way as we are bringing this to fruition.
It's interesting. Do you have a metaphor you like?
I don't know that I have a metaphor I like, but I will say I love this. I think there is, and every researcher is going to give you this answer to every question, which is, it depends. It depends. It does really depend. I think ideally you're running a research team that is holistic enough and reflective enough of the different levels, to come back to today, that you know where people are slotted in. You have your rapid researchers who are doing that usability and concept testing quickly to help de-risk things that are already decided. You have your visioning researchers who are doing these big projects to figure out what could be next and what are those opportunities. You have your super strategic researchers that are figuring out what the opportunities are that are being missed. But somebody has a sense of how those are all fitting together. I think, unfortunately, often what happens is you have one researcher or two researchers who are trying to do all of those things. And it's really difficult to balance. And I think we often come and have these questions like, how do I ever do foundational research? They just want me to do usability. It's like we haven't actually established those roles. So maybe it's more like a board game of some sort, or a strategy game, that ideally you are the kingpin player, but I think sometimes we end up being more stuck on the chutes and ladders.
So I think this is really neat too, because part of when I've talked with people who are especially either looking for their first job or their second job, there is and I can relate to this because I was in this position before too, where I want a researcher job. So I go and I type in like UX research on Indeed or on LinkedIn, and it gives me back a list, and they all have the same label. So they're all the same job, except they're not, are they?
No.
Right? And to your point, it seems like it's actually quite contextual. And so maybe an interesting metaphor here too, when you think about these research roles, is like that of maybe a mechanic, where you can be a mechanic and be incredible at working on, standard cars and whatnot, and have no idea how to fix a train, or no idea how to fix a tank, or maybe like a specialty vehicle of some kind, right? So it describes a set of general processes and tools that we have, but you might actually be really specialized or well-suited for a certain subset of that, and they're probably not going to tell you that in the job posting, will they?
Yeah.
No.
In that way, I think about actually a lot like dating. You're trying to find the perfect match for you, and unfortunately, you're going to have to swipe right a lot on stuff that ends up being kind of bad, and you might even go into an interview for a job you're really excited about, and it just doesn't match now. Now, truly, when they say we'll contact you in 6 months if there's something else, they might contact you in 6 months if there's something else. That does happen, I swear. I know it doesn't seem likely. But it is just about how do we find that piece. I think there's a lot of temptation right now to try to be everything to everyone. If anybody's read, I have a piece called Really You Don't Have to Be a Mixed Methods Researcher. Really, you don't have to be a mixed methods researcher. But there's a lot of pressure there now to say, well, I can do everything. You can't, I promise. There are going to be people that are amazing at surveys and people that are amazing at interviews and amazing at strategy. Pick your lane. But it does mean there's a chance it's not going to be a fit for something that you just don't have that piece. But if we think about statistical significance, there's 400 research methods. You learning 2 or 3 more doesn't actually increase your chance that that one given job is going to be the one for you. And that's okay. Like, think of all the people you've dated that you're like, I wish I hadn't dated that person. Or people who ask you out that you're like, oh, no, that's not for me. That's not about you. It's not about them. It's just a match. So forgive yourself a little. Find your besheret, which is your beloved. Give it some time.
So I feel like now that we have some context about like what the role is and what it isn't and how varied it can be. I remember when we were talking, you brought up a really great point that I think it would be great for you to dig into a little bit, which is how do these jobs and roles actually get created internally at a company? Because one of the things when you're actually looking to land a role, right, there's all these machinations going on behind the scene. And you only see like the web page with the job posting, but there are like 500 people involved and a bunch of Gantt charts and flow charts and org charts and all sorts of stuff that was all based on an understanding that you, and frankly, I still have a lot of questions about. So maybe, Louise, you can talk a bit about, in your experience, how have you seen roles get created and what does that kind of say about what you might want to do as a candidate in order to demonstrate you might be a good fit?
Yeah. I will not bury the lead and say I think the end result is right place, right time, right person. And it is a lot about serendipity in there. But if I can go back, I think it's important to really understand so as you said, how the role gets created. It starts with finance and the board and determining, okay, what was our revenue, coming in, or what are our goals if it's a startup and they don't have revenue yet, and figuring out those pieces. And then that gets determined in Q4 usually for the following year. And then they determine, okay, this is how much we want to spend on headcount. Then they allocate that across all of the...
Can I pause you for 1 sec? So I think a really important thing to note is if you're applying for a job that was opened in October, the decision to hire for that role was made last November.
Potentially, yes.
Yes, but okay, so maybe not.
We're getting there.
We'll continue on, but I think that was a bit of a mind-blowing moment when I kind of understood that just would never make intuitive sense to me, but it does when you're looking at it from a high level, maybe.
Yeah, and I would say, there are a lot of different types of companies out there, so this might be more true for larger companies, like the Googles and the Metas of the world.
Yeah.
But so that gets determined, again, it gets allocated across all the disciplines, and then research gets 5 heads, they call them, right? That's 5 open positions that they can hire for. Then research determines, okay, where do we want to place them among all the different places that we could place them? And there are lots of conversations that go on, and then it gets released. Release happens maybe sometime in Q1. So that could be in January, that could be in March, depending on how the business is structured. And then there are often times when actually headcount doesn't get released all at once. They actually release it over the course of the year. So they have 5 heads, but it's like, okay, we're gonna hire 1 in Q1, 2 in Q2, and 2 in Q3, and none in Q4, but those are the targets.
In Q, just for anyone who doesn't know, that's quarters, right?
Thank you. Yeah.
Breaking the year into 4 equal parts of 3 months.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's the structure of it. Now to your question about okay, a role opens up in October. How did that happen? It could have happened last Q4 when it got discussed, but then it can also be priorities shift within the business.
Right.
And suddenly AI comes along and, shoot, we're behind the 8 ball. We got to get on this. And if the head of research can sort of start negotiating and borrow a headcount from a different part of the business because, hey, we really need to get ahead of this. We really need to understand what's going on. And so then that role can get created.
I want to give us kudos. We made it 19 minutes without mentioning AI.
Oh, I'm sorry, I broke that.
No, that's great. You did excellent there. I think we should be proud of ourselves.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really interesting point, right? Because again, you have such limited surface area when you're when you're applying for a job, and there's so much context and understanding that any employer has about this role and what it takes to be successful in the role that is not going to be immediately obvious to you, at least by looking at a job description, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So let's talk a bit about the actual hiring process, right? So what the job posting is created. I think that there's a lot of people out there who have expressed exasperation reading these job postings and being like, WTF? Who are the human beings with 2 years of experience that can do all these things, right? The actual words on that page, where do they come from?
Legal. Yeah, if you'll notice, most of what's in there is very constrained, right? Do put your researcher hat and read through, and if there's a couple of lines that are really different or calling out something that you're like, oh, that's kind of a weird thing, we're probably flagging like, there's something a little weird about this team and we're looking for someone that can deal with that weirdness. And if you can, like, bring it up. Hey, I'm really good with dealing with conflict. I'm really good with dealing when people don't know how to work with UX. When those things are flagged a little bit, go on. But there's not a lot, right? Like the recruiter is the person that's doing that first screen. They have some expertise with the hiring manager. There are some amazing UX recruiters out there. Mary Dittmar, I'll shout out, that as they've grown, they really do know the fields. But a lot of people don't. Like you have to consider Google has hundreds of recruiters, and it's almost just a checklist. Like, how do we get you in the door? How do we make sure that you have 70, 80% of this? And then everything else really happens after the fact, right? So it's pretty generic. Don't get too stuck on it. Don't apply for jobs that require 10 years of experience if you have 2. But do apply for jobs that have 4 years of experience if you have 2 and you're confident in those skills. It's not a do or die in most cases. For the government, it is. Just do whatever they say because it's the government's annoying. But otherwise, there's a lot more flexibility. But most of that is literally just like, how do we make sure we've done this and written this correctly to completely cover our butts? We're never going to end up on the front page of the New York Times about this, and we'll figure it out when we talk to you. At least that's been my experience.
Same. I would take it with a very small grain of salt. With what they say in it. Oftentimes what happens in the hiring process, they started out with an idea of who they wanted. They interviewed a bunch of people and then said, oh, you know what, actually, now that I think about it, this person doesn't quite satisfy our need here, or that role actually has changed. We no longer need a researcher over this part of the business. So again, it's take it with a grain of salt. Yep. I will also say, having a job posting doesn't mean, one, that it's still live, that the process could have already started months ago and they are very at the end of their hiring process to potentially select a candidate, and also that there are no jobs at that company. Because like I said, it can be a right place, right time, right person, and suddenly they are thinking, they haven't opened a role, they haven't posted the job posting, and but they're still thinking like, hey, I want somebody in this field in 3 months, and you just happen to have met them at a meetup, a party, talked about what you do, and they're like, shoot, this is the person that I want, and so suddenly things get moved around, and it's a match, and then you can get hired.
Yeah, there's a lot more flexibility there, I think, than you might imagine, and people figuring out what they need. But do meet people. I know it's so hard, everyone here today in person. Talk to everyone here you don't know. We were actually, Louise and I at the beginning of this, were bragging about a colleague that I used to manage and now Louise distantly manages, probably through another manager, who is one of the most brilliant researchers I've worked with, empathetic to, I want to say to a fault, but not. He's spectacular. And it was truly like I was applying for a role and I decided not to take it. And I was like, you should really talk to Gus. This is why I think these are the 5 things that are so great about this person for this role. So there is a lot of opportunity to that to help match those things in. And yeah, the job still might not be there. I will flag for large companies, Google's, Meta, et cetera. If you see a job posting online that just says UX researcher and doesn't mention a specific team,
that's a good point.
That's a pipeline filler. So that's just us trying to get a bunch of people in that might fulfill later roles so that when we do have a role we need to fill very quickly, we have a higher chance of getting a couple of people. But that there might not actually be a role even in the next 6 months attached to that. So look for ones that are a little more specific.
Can I actually continue that point? I think it's really important for for the larger companies that have what are quote unquote these pipelines. What happens is that you have an entire set of people who are tasked with sourcing and recruiting folks and getting them into the door. And then once they have gone through a generic interview process and passed, then they get matched inside within the company. So the people that you're interviewing with actually will not be your colleagues. But there's a certain set of standards that these companies have, and they want people to pass that bar first before then figuring out where is the right place for them in this particular company.
That's
especially if you have niche skills. We love that. Like you might be the person who's really good at strategy or really good at quantitative something. And then the second they find that person, they just want a lot of people there, right? And huge companies have a year to do so.
I think one thing that's worth touching on here quickly and making a note is what you mentioned about they are thinking about making a hire, but they haven't made the job posting, but because they met you or because they know you, something happens. Or a friend it makes a referral like you did with your friend Gus. There's a difference between like networking, I'm going to put in air quotes, and what that was.
Yeah.
Right? That was trusted relationships built over time, often by both people demonstrating to each other, supporting each other, helping each other. You can imagine a situation in which you're a researcher, you have research skills, you have a friend who's maybe starting a business or starting a startup, or maybe they're a product manager, and you can say, like, why don't I just help you do some interviews and show you how it works, right? And by doing that, you've demonstrated the skills to somebody who's like, damn, so-and-so went out of their way to really help me out with this. That person's now an advocate for you and will go, and when they see an opportunity, they're going to go and try and make that happen for you, right? And that's very different from like going to a generic networking event and exchanging business cards and like adding to your LinkedIn profile, because those are very weak connections and they don't really mean anything. And what you really want to like, whatever, it's not a small or large number of people who really are in a position where they not only want to advocate for you, but actually can, right? Mm-hmm. This person taught me how to do research, right? With interviews or whatever it is. And they were super easy to learn from, and they were really helpful. And that person will go out, and when they see an opening, they're going to try and advocate for you, right? So the power of like real relationships based on doing stuff rather than networking events, maybe. Cool. Let's transition a little bit to, so job posting gets created. So we have a question from Lana, who's on the live stream. And shout out to Lana for this question. She wants to know if you can get into research without an academia or a statistics background. So, you're looking at this job posting and it says they want you to be proficient in R. And I can tell you, I've been in this field a while, I don't know anything about R, and I could never do that stuff, right? But it says they want you to be proficient in R, and so you say, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't apply, right? Do you think if you don't have a background in academia or statistics or something similar, this individual has a background in journalism and is taking UX classes, is research a realistic goal for them to work towards? Yeah.
I would say absolutely. This field is full of people who have come from various backgrounds. I would say we're growing. Maybe we're in our adolescent phase. I don't know how you would characterize the field of UX research. But there are pathways that are getting more solidified. For example, the pathway from academia, which wasn't necessarily there for a while. But you do not have to. There are certain things like specialty skills like R. Yeah. I do not know how to do R. I did take a class in it, and it was difficult. But maybe I can circumvent that with AI now. But I think it's at its core, it's about curiosity and asking good questions. And then the other things that you can start layering on top of it, like methods and whatnot, and analytical methods as well, then you can start to build your skill set. That might mean different things like taking courses, but you do not have to take courses. But it does mean that you have to stay curious and be open to trying new things and partnering with people so that they can teach you and do different types of projects to sort of get your feet wet and figure out, like, is this the right field for you?
Yeah.
I would definitely agree. I will say if the posting is calling for R, they probably are looking for someone that is quantitative. Don't apply to that one in all likelihood. But there's lots of methods that won't require that. Do you need to know R in specific? No, probably not. What they're calling out is we don't have a lot of money and it's open source and we still need someone who can do statistics. There are other open source programs like JASP, if you're very familiar with those, do still apply. Like R is not the requirement. They'll learn R, it's a great program. It's not fun to learn though. The learning curve is terrible. But once you're there, it's great. So make sure that you are a fit for that. If you're a qualitative researcher, apply for qualitative roles. Don't apply for quantitative roles. Don't apply for mixed methods roles. Those interviews aren't going to go well. Like, you should be able to answer questions like, what's R squared value? And how do I figure out the right, is my data normal? How do I make sure I'm picking the right statistics test for these things? And in those cases, take classes if you want to be quantitative. Survey development and distribution, like I studied it for years and it's still very difficult. But there's lots of methods that you can pick up other ways. Just go after those more qualitative roles and definitely stay curious. I will say, I think one of the things that we're seeing, we saw kind of this gradual growth of UX research and UX in general. And then we did see this kind of spike in the pandemic that I do think brought more diversity in terms of backgrounds into the fields and perhaps at times less research rigor. And we are seeing a pullback from that, right? People are pushing on this more because there were some negatives to that. But that doesn't mean learn R, it means learn hypothesis testing. Like, go back and remember your biology texts. A lot of that of like, how do I actually design a good experiment is what we're looking at, not do you know the difference between a two-sided and a one-sided t-test, right? Like that's still very much if you want to be quanti. Be quanti if you want, don't if you don't.
We're getting a bunch of follow-up questions here from the remote stream, so we're just going to jump into some of them because they're super relevant. Question from Krishna, are there specific UX research courses, boot camps that they recommend, and particularly ones that hiring managers would really value, ideally affordable ones? Is there anything that you've seen or you think has been like helpful as a resource to help?
I will hot take this and say I don't like boot camps. I think they're really expensive. I think for the most part, they're very surface level. And unfortunately, often they get into interviews and you kind of push on the wall and it falls right over. Is that to say all boot camps are bad? No. But for how much they cost, I would go a different route. Courses wise, I honestly recommend things like Coursera, like go back and look at hypothesis testing. But the biggest thing is going to be doing. So start volunteering, reach out. I actually even used to like coach groups of women to start their own projects and do things like that. There's lots of people doing things like that. You want to be on the ground. So not only do you want that basis, so yes, do some of the courses that are very affordable, like under $100. If you live here in San Francisco, the community colleges here are all free. Take a statistics class, take an experimentation class, hypothesis class. But start doing, because the stakeholders are the biggest part. When we started this conversation, we're like, methods is 20%. Get the method, but you also have to figure out, like, how are people coming to you? What is your PM actually asking you for? How do you balance all of these things? How do you know when to push and when not to push? And you need real people for that, not mock tests or classes.
Plus on to that. So as a hiring manager, I don't look for somebody who's taken courses in any particular from any particular place. So I just frankly don't look at that. I do want to understand what are the limitations or what are the boundaries of your knowledge and understanding. Do you understand the pros and cons of different methods, kinds of things? And then to your point, the methods only get you so far. I can do an extremely rigorous study and it goes nowhere. So it's like 50% of your job is the marketing of that research. The deliverable is not that. The deliverable is not the be-all, end-all. It's you making sure that you're socializing your insights at the right time with the right people to inform that decision when it happens.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I feel like we're transitioning right into this. I'm going to mix this with a couple question from the audience as well. So we've got the job posting. We've read that. We've gotten over our mental barrier to apply, and it's asking us for some resources. It's asking us for a resume. Maybe it asks for a cover letter. And then Shelby and Miri are asking about the role of a UX research portfolio. Is that a thing that someone at an entry level needs, and what goes into that? I will say I've never had a research portfolio in my life. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I know a lot of places ask for it. So like maybe pick which one you feel most strongly about, like resume, portfolio. I'll throw it to you, Zoe, first.
I talk a lot about this. Feel free to YouTube my name, and we'll pop up. Your resume is your most important. It should be impact focused, especially as you get to mid and senior levels. What was the result of what you did? When you're very first starting an intern, yes, I do want to know more of the methods. I don't expect you to have a ton of product impact. There are other kinds of impact, leadership and tough problems. That was what talk with SDXD, so do check that out if you're interested in resumes. I have also never had a portfolio. I've been asked for one once. I sent them my Medium account, and it seemed to go okay. Is that to say that you will never need one? No. Lawton Plybus just wrote a great article on this. I don't think you do. You definitely need a presentation of your work, which is very similar to a portfolio, but it's much more visual, and you're going to talk through it. I think they are a blast to make and present. Maybe I'm the exception there, but also happy to talk on that. I've given a talk on that as well. But my dog has just full on passed out. Tell the story of your work. So much of this is like sharing what you're doing and why. But resume, very important in my mind. When I applied to Figma, I didn't need a portfolio. So I think maybe that's still true. You don't need one at Google for researchers. Designers still do, of course.
I'm going to take the opposite view.
Nice. Love it.
And say your resume is important for someone to scan through and look for a few keywords. I would not spend endless amounts of time perfecting your resume. There have been times, and I know on the other side too, there have been times when you're lucky if the person has like glanced at it before they interview you sometimes, because things move fast and it's like, oh wait, you were doing all this work and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm like interviewing somebody next.
Can I pause you for a second? So when you're scanning, can you almost walk me through the decision tree? Right, you're going to get, let's say, 100 or 200 people send a resume in, right? And then there's the pile that you don't look at, and then there's going to be a smaller pile that you actually have a conversation with.
Yeah.
Right. How do these things get, like, mentally when you're looking at these? How do you, in general, sort these into the buckets?
Well, this differs greatly by the size of the company.
Right.
So as a hiring manager at a mid-sized to large company, we don't look at any of the resumes until the recruiter passes them to us and says, or puts them into a system, and we read through a few of them. But I think, in scan, you're asking for like, what am I scanning for?
Right, yeah.
Impact.
Yeah.
Is probably the number one. I'm not going to put these in order, but the next one I will say, I am looking for qual versus quant, or just like I'm looking for T-shaped people, right? And T-shaped meaning like you have a depth of an entry level, at least just like this is the type of the set of methods that I typically go to, whether it's qual or quant, and then maybe some understanding of the other ones, at least to know when to go and talk to other people about how to do those methods. And the third, I actually think, is the fun stuff. Like your interests, passions, the things that you do on the side, because it's fun to work with people, and you're going to be, there's an amazing graph of like the amount of time that you spend with your coworkers versus your family and your friends, and it's like, it's really quite high comparatively. And so I'm looking for somebody who I want to sit next to, virtually or otherwise.
So portfolio-wise, if it is a requirement, maybe I can jump in a little bit here with some of the stuff that I've seen where people send me their portfolio, and it's like 2 projects that comprise 130 slides.
Oof.
And I think it's really important to understand that is like, and I'm stepping out of my lane here, so you can correct me if you think you disagree, but a huge part of your job as a researcher is to communicate really effectively and make the main thing, so that your stakeholder, right, you learn 20 things in a study. If you try and convey all those 20 things with equal weight, none of them are going to be remembered. And the decision that you really wanted to influence is just going to be made on intuition because none of the stuff that you did was remembered. And by having a portfolio of 130 slides, or where you include all the information, right? And I get it. You did the work. You're really excited about it. It was really cool and fun, and you're proud of it. You want to talk about all the things. But from their point of view, like, what is the stuff that they really need to understand? Can you plan a project? Can you execute a project? Do you know how to pick a project that's going to be important to the people you're working with? Can you communicate findings clearly? Like, you can summarize that in maybe 10 slides if you were to do it in a presentation format. And it gives you the opportunity for so much follow-up conversation, which is going to be way more engaging and interesting to the person that you're interviewing with, right?
Yeah. I fully agree with that. I do want to take a quick step back and say, I actually fully agree. Don't spend too long on your resume. Spend 80%. Be the 80% person, because we're not going to spend that long. There's a lot of temptation to over-focus on it because it is the first gate. And you feel like, if I just make it perfect, there is no perfect. It's always going to be about match. It's always about the other thing. Get it good enough and leave it. But impact, which we definitely agree on, is what is the outcome? Why does this matter? And your resume, your portfolio, or your presentation all need to come back to that. There is this temptation to say, especially as a researcher, and I think even more so from academic backgrounds, where you're like, I want to demonstrate rigor. That you're like, I'm going to show you every little thing I did, so that if you were a reviewer too, you would find no fault with my methodology. That's not possible. Why? Because of how we started this conversation. Mm-hmm. It has to do with the business constraints. It has to do with the users you were focused on. Information that you can't share with me as the hiring manager because it's proprietary to your company. Constraints like time, constraints like what your team was familiar with or what your role was enabled. All of those factors are going to affect the research. And I can't judge that by you showing me, I talked to 8 people and this is exactly the output I had on all of these other pieces. It's just not possible. And it's going to be 130 slides. And FYI, you have a max 3 minutes to get people's attention. So what are you highlighting? You're highlighting the skill of how do I take a bunch of data and figure out a way to demonstrate that data, which, to Alex's points, you're not proving to me that you're a good researcher in your output. You're proving to me that you're a good researcher in your process. You know how to sync with people. You know how to keep that North Star in line. You know how to balance it against those other things. And that's what you're showing me through the lens of the research. We have this temptation to say, I'm going to show you the research and you're going to figure everything else out on your own. Reverse those, right? You're showing me your process. It should be short. A great portfolio or presentation is very visual. It's to the point. And you're really talking to me about, like, what was hard? How did you navigate that? Show me some conflict. Tell me about that PM that sucked and how you navigated through it. Like, give me a sense of how you will be on the ground. I will say the one thing I do disagree with you on is the human part in resumes. And I'll call that out because I think it causes bias in terms of hiring. So I don't look at that at all. So if you talk to me, I'll tell you to remove it. But the reason I highlight this is not to disagree. The reason I highlight this is we are very different hiring managers. Mm-hmm.
That's a great point.
And you're going to face both of us. You're going to date one of us one day in a hiring manager sense, right? So am I going to not hire you because of it? No, but it's not something I'm going to look at. That doesn't mean that our jobs are different or that you are different. It just means that we're different as hiring managers. But we both agree on impact, so focus there.
Yeah, and I think it's a great thing. Like we have this sense sometimes that these roles are at different companies with the same name are sterile and interchangeable, and they're definitely not. Right? A lot of these like research departments, if you will, are shaped by who is leading them. And if you see a company go through some like turmoil and turnover at the leadership level, a lot of times what happens is you have a new leader come in to, let's say, lead the product team, and then immediately 30 or 40% of the people within that organization depart for greener pastures, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not amazingly talented people necessarily. It's that the leader is responsible for delivering on the objective, and they're trusted to do that. And so they'll shape their organization in a way that works for them to be able to deliver on the objective. And that affects things like team culture and operating cadence and how much independence you have and how much, how feedback is given and all sorts of things. And so just to your points, right, it's the fit thing is a very real, I used to think that was such a cop-out where like, it's like, oh, it's just not a right fit. And you're like, bro, like, come on, right? Like I don't feel good about that. But that is very much a real thing where it's like, this is not, your shape doesn't fit the shape that we're looking for. And that doesn't mean you're not incredibly talented and capable at doing this job, right? So a good thing to keep in mind. I want to be conscientious of time. So let's just jump at a really high level and kind of, if you can briefly describe the interview process or a generic interview process, what at an IC level, what are the steps? So we already talked about resumes and initial conversation. What are the other steps in the process, and what are you trying to learn at those steps before you get to it? Yeah, we're going to give them the offer.
Okay, so we've passed the resume line. You've had a phone screen, I think is what we were just talking about, and either that can be with a recruiter or with a person on the team or the hiring manager themselves. The next part of the process usually entails what's called an on-site, although virtual maybe more so these days. But it entails usually a presentation, a group presentation. You will take a project from they will give you a prompt to say, hey, tell me about a time that you had impact at your organization, at a previous company or whatever from your past. So you will give that presentation. It's usually about 30 minutes to 45 minutes, and there are sometimes times for questions. And then you will have a set of one-on-one interviews with a few different people. Usually you'll have one with the hiring manager, and you might dig in more with the research skills or how you would operate on that team. But then you'll have what are called cross-functional interviews, so with a designer or with a product manager or a data scientist on that team. And they're going to dig into a few other areas. One, collaboration. How well do you work with people who are non-researchers? Two, they're going to dig into what's called, sometimes gets called as product sense. It's controversial about whether it exists or not, but it's basically like, do you understand that we're not doing research just for research's sake? We're trying to build something and that's useful and valuable to customers. And so we want to sort of understand the degree to which you get that and that you're able to apply the research in this context. There are also oftentimes values interviews. Every company has some sort of set of company values, and oftentimes they will ask you, for example, at Figma, we have a value around building community. And so they can ask questions like, hey, tell me about a time that you built community. It doesn't have to be job related, but just in your personal life too. So those are the types of interviews.
That's great. Yeah. Do you have anything quick to add there? Because I have a separate question that I wanted to fling your way as well.
The one that I would say that I think sticks people up, and different companies have this, maybe Figma doesn't, is a mock scenario, which either will happen very early or very late. And we're going to ask you to walk through how you would handle a given research process. And it'll be some sort of very weird thing, and you're going to come up with a whole research thing despite not knowing your stakeholders and all the other things we normally would. There's a very specific way, to Alex's point. We're not judging your methods, we're judging your process. This is very confusing. Meet with someone who has been on the other side, and they can coach you through these, because these are very weird, but they are pretty common.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we'll do a couple of questions from the folks in person if you have in just a second. So line those up in your mind here. Couple of things here that I think is really interesting coming in from the live stream. Nafula was asking about red flags on resumes or otherwise, where you see that and you're like, hell no, right? Like, this is not, maybe there's other things that look really good, and then you see this thing and you're like, that's going to be a no for me. Whether those are in the interviews or on the resume. So
I do want to wrap up one quick thought.
Yeah, please.
Your recruiter is your friend. Talk to your recruiter. They will tell you what these processes are. I know we just ran you through a bunch of different interview types that you're like, oh God, what do I know? The recruiter will tell you what they are, and they will give you some idea of what they are. Ask them questions, please.
They are really good if they have a very high success rate at placing candidates. So they want you to be successful, right? You have a friendly relationship with them, even if you don't have with the people you're interviewing with.
I will say I don't have a lot of like clear red flags. Why? Because methods all depend. Green flag is impact. I want to know what came of it. The flag that comes up for me a lot as somebody who's quantitative is people who are trying to present as something they're not. You ran a survey with 50 people. No, you didn't. That's not a survey. That's a qualitative questionnaire. And I'm now very concerned that you think it's a survey, right? So not knowing in interviews, if you are going for a quantitative method, I'm going to ask you things around R squared. I'm going to ask you things around fit and picking the right method. And if you can't come up with it and you're like, oh, well, I made a couple surveys, you're not mixed methods. You know qualitative and you know qualitative questionnaires, and that's great. It's a great method to know. But you do have to know the constraints within that. For the most part, we're looking at like trade-offs between methods much more than we are specific ones, but quant does seem to trip people up more. So pro tip, don't lie. As surface as that sounds, I know how tempting it is to present, to try and get into that next one, but you just have a different skill set, and that's a great skill set too. So show me that you know how amazing the skill set you do have is. But otherwise focus on impact, not input. That's if it's all input. Interviewed 12 people, talked to 14 people. I'm wondering, like, did you not know where this went? Do you not have a sense of it? If you're very much it's your first job, that's more acceptable. But you should have some sense of why you did what you did, even if it doesn't have product percentages tied to it. Remember, there's lots of different kinds of impact. So show me that you know why you did what you did. And if you can't, I do have questions.
I have one quick story about this. When I was interviewing with Airbnb, I got asked the question, and I was a less seasoned researcher at that point, but we got talking about sample size. And I got asked the question of like, okay, how many people should you, interview in this or in this particular scenario? And I kind of got tripped up about it. And I answered to the best of my ability. But I could tell from the interviewer that like I didn't get to the answer that they were looking for. And so at the end of the interview, I just asked, hey, like, I would love to actually like, can you help me understand a little bit better, like where, like what were you looking for? Or rather, like, I don't like to say what was the right answer, but like, let's talk about it. I want to learn. And he was really struck by that. It's like that learning attitude that you want to demonstrate to the portfolio. Nothing goes right. So like, tell me what got messed up and what did you learn? In terms of one red flag for me in the whole scenario is about how you handle bad circumstances and how you talk about it and how you talk about people and companies. And so there's a lot of difficulty that we encounter in our jobs, and you don't have to paint a full rosy picture. However, you don't want to badmouth about like the terrible so-and-so that you worked with. You really want to try to understand the full picture, and then what could you have done differently in that particular scenario?
1,000%. Like, definitely go ahead. And say you don't know when you don't know. That's okay. You can answer something. I'm not sure about that, but let me tell you about something similar. It's so powerful. I was in an interview once where the person was bad-mouthing some employees and bad-mouthing some other things, and I was like, God, they want to be so confident that they're kind of coming across as a jerk. And I asked them a really difficult question on purpose because I was like, if they say I don't know right now, I'm going to forgive this. They're just stressed. And I saw this. They Googled it. And I was like, no. Like, that's a red flag. Don't Google things in the middle of your interview. It's okay to not know. Just say you don't know. Show me you know the limits.
Of all the hiring managers types to interview with and try and bullshit that you know something that you don't, people who specialize in qualitative research is probably not the ones that you want to do that with. I can't agree more about do not shit talk any of your former people. And like, think about, first of all, because they're looking at the way you treated other people, because they're far away now, right? Behind closed doors, you're with somebody else. It's a private meeting. The way you treated those people you had a hard time with is going to be really indicative of, in a moment where it's hard to be charitable, and it's easy to, talk about how all the failures were their fault. How you treat them is going to tell them how you're going to treat them on the job if you get up with the role. And so you can take something like, my manager undermined me at every go, and all the product managers are completely disinterested and total dicks, and I was not able to do anything except usability tests. You can just translate that to, I had a really difficult situation, and really what I should have done from the get-go was really focus on building trust. And I didn't do a good enough job at that, and so I was never able to take on some of the more strategic projects that I wanted to. And so I tried a number of different things like A and B and C. Ultimately, they didn't pan out, but that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited about this role, because I think I can do a better job this time around. Tell me how that sounds, right? That, there we go. Right?
And it's impact, not outcome, right? Like the outcome at the last job was it didn't go well. The impact at this next job is he knows how to deal with his stakeholders better.
Yeah.
He knows how to consider them and think about things from a different way.
So much more mature.
I don't care that it didn't go well.
Yeah.
That's okay.
They don't care.
Because what he's showing me is he's going to be good where I am.
Yeah.
And that's all I care about now.
Yeah, totally.